Hi everyone. So yeah, my name's Ben, and as Catherine just said, I'll be talking to you about intergenerational justice. Yeah, if there are any issues with hearing me or with seeing my slides, please do just pipe up quickly, because hopefully you can see and hear me though. So I'll talk for about half an hour, and then I should have my phone to make sure I know when half an hour's up. And then we'll have about a quarter of an hour for discussion. So this phrase intergenerational justice, we can kind of break down, of course, into its two component terms, and I'll just kind of briefly go over what I think we might mean by each of those two terms. So we'll have a bit of kind of focus as to what we're actually thinking about. So first of all, justice. Justice, of course, is a pretty old topic in philosophy. You find Plato and talking about justice. And there have been a few different understandings of what we might mean, and perhaps it's helpful to help us understand what justice is, or what we might think justice is, to contrast it with other kinds of moral reasons we might have. So one way of understanding what justice is by contrasting it with moral reasons based on what's sometimes called beneficence. So beneficence is just a kind of reason to do good to others, right? Reason to benefit others. And some people think that we can contrast justice and beneficence by saying that whereas beneficence is kind of just good to do, or from the perspective of the person being benefited, nice to have, when we're talking about claims of justice, actually we're talking about entitlement, right? Things that people have a kind of obligation to ensure that others get. So we can maybe contrast justice and beneficence in that way by saying that the one is just kind of has these kind of basic moral reasons behind it, but the other maybe is something slightly stronger. It's to do with entitlement or obligation. Second way of understanding this, not necessarily inconsistent with the first, but you could hold one or both of these ideas. We might again contrast justice and beneficence by saying that whereas our reasons of beneficence are non-enforceable, so, I might have reason to benefit all of you in various ways, but nobody can coercively insist that I benefit you in those ways. Reasons of justice maybe are enforceable by the state or by some other authority. So if someone has a claim to something as a matter of justice, then some people think that we can say, actually, that's the point at which the state or some other authority is entitled to step in and make sure that they get that thing, or make sure that others don't prevent them from having it. And finally, a fairly famous analysis of justice from slightly more recent political philosophy comes from John Rawls, the famous political philosopher. Rawls is thinking about particularly what we call distributive justice here, which is justice in the distribution of benefits and burdens. And Rawls analyzes justice as fairness here. So what would be agreed by people who are trying to decide how to live together under situations under which they can all come to a kind of fair agreement. So there you go, a few kind of different, very rough analyses of what we might mean by justice. I won't rely on any particular one, but we can maybe talk about this in discussion as to whether some of the issues I raise are really issues of justice, or whether they're maybe just issues of beneficence instead. Okay, so that's justice. What about intergenerational? At least three things we might mean here, at least three kinds of idea that we might be interested in when we're thinking about intergenerational justice. And I'll talk about two of them today. If I had more time, I'd talk about all three, but I think for interest of time, it's better to focus on these first two. So first of all, I think if you ask the average person on the street to kind of talk about the phrase intergenerational justice, I suspect that they might start to talk about various concrete issues. And I also suspect that those concrete issues would concern relationships between presently existing generations. So older people versus younger people, or the middle-aged working people versus children, or versus the retired. Right, so these are questions of justice between different generations who coexist, who are contemporaneous. Right, so we might ask, as a question of justice, whether the generation you belong to, or whether the age group you belong to, affect what you're entitled to. But of course, that's not the only thing that we might mean by intergenerational justice. Right? We might be interested not only in what we owe to people with whom we coexist, but also to people in the far future, right? So we can also have an effect on the lives, on the society, on the world that people in the far future inherit. So questions of distant future justice might concern how we should act toward when we can affect how well people's lives go in the distant future, and as I'll talk about, when we can affect their very identities. And then finally, I won't talk about this, happy for people to bring it up in discussion if you'd like to, but of course, it's not only the far future who we might owe things to, we might also owe things to people in the distant past, to our ancestors. This is a kind of less popular topic in contemporary, at least Western philosophy, but of course, it's a huge issue, a huge ethical and political issue historically and in many societies around the world. Right? There are many people who have very strong beliefs that they have obligations to their ancestors, even when those ancestors were people with whom they didn't directly interact. Okay, so as I've said, I'll try to talk about our obligations to the present, to each other, as we exist in the present coextensively, and I'll try to talk a bit about our obligations to the distant future. So come first to the present then. As I said, I think if you were to broach the subject of intergenerational justice with the average person who maybe hasn't studied philosophy before, I suspect that you'd get some concrete examples of two different kinds of things. So first of all, you might get some concrete examples of inequalities or unfairness between different age groups. So people might point out, for instance, that in general, younger people tend to have less money, less wealth than older people. In general, in many societies, middle-aged people are not entitled to free education or free transport, whereas younger people are often entitled to both of those things. And older people, certainly retired people, for instance, tend to be entitled to free transport, for instance. So you get this kind of sense that different age groups, and of course, young, middle-aged, old are very rough ways of cutting up those age groups. We could do it in different ways, but different age groups seem like they are treated as if they have different entitlements, right? It's seen as not unjust if one group is significantly less well off than another group, or if the state sanctions certain kinds of benefits like free education to one group, but not to another group. So that's one kind of inequality we might be interested in, inequality between age groups. But you might also find people talking about inequalities or perceived injustices between generations. And we'll come in a moment to this distinction between age groups and generations. But so think about the fact that today's retirees, or people who are approaching retirement, who are kind of roughly this generation that are sometimes called the baby boomers, not only do they tend to have more wealth than today's young people, it's often claimed that they had greater opportunities when they were young. So it's not just, according to this kind of quite pervasive sense of injustice that you hear from younger people. It's not just that today's older people have more right now, it's that they also had more when they were in this age group of youth. So notice the difference there. In one sense, in one case, we've got a difference between different age groups, right? Different, older people, younger people. And in another sense, you have this inequality between different generations when they were occupying the same age group, right? So it's unfair, young people, today's young people might say, that my parents and my grandparents had so much more opportunity when they were young. Now, whether or not that's an accurate picture, that's a different kind of complaint than the complaint that people might make that today's older people currently have more than today's younger people. So that distinction is quite important for a very dominant view of age group justice that comes from the political philosopher Norman Daniels. So Daniels wants to say, roughly speaking, that whereas age group inequality is not unjust, intergenerational inequality is unjust. And the reason for this, he thinks, is that we should observe, first of all, that age isn't like other kinds of demographic factors where we might see inequalities between different groups. So age is such that most of us, if we're lucky, will occupy various age groups throughout our lives, right? So we start as infants, we move through adolescence, middle age, and if we're lucky, we make it to old age. So we occupy these different age groups at different times. But most other demographic facts, our race, our sex, our disability status, are such that although we might occupy different categories at different times. We might not, depending on the particular feature. There's certainly no guarantee that we will occupy different, or each different state at different times. So Daniel suggests that because of this fact about age, because we'll all be in each group, it's not unfair to treat different age groups differently. He develops this account that he calls the prudential lifespan account, which says that because of this feature of age, because of the way we occupy different age groups at different times, we can treat the kind of interpersonal problem of age group justice. We can kind of frame it in a different way. We can think about it as what we might call an intrapersonal problem. So a problem that just affects a single person across their lives. And the intrapersonal problem that Daniels wants to frame the interpersonal problem of age group justice as is just how to allocate resources across a life. So Daniels says, look, if we imagine that we're sort of planning our lives from the start and we're going to live through to old age, what would be a prudent, what would be a sensible way to allocate resources across our lifespan? And what he concludes is, well, if you're being sensible, you'll probably want to weight your allocation towards your youth. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, what happens in our youth affects how our lives go, kind of is pervasive throughout our whole lives, right? So if you have certain kinds of bad experiences when you're young, certain kinds of illnesses or certain kinds of lack of opportunity, that might affect how your whole life goes, right? So it might have this kind of ripple effect throughout your whole life. Whereas if you have kind of very poor health in your old age, that's going to have less of an effect on the rest of your life. Second of all, when we're thinking about particularly central opportunities or goods that are necessary to try and make sure that we survive youth, these are particularly important, Daniels thinks, to allocate to our youth rather than to our old age, because if we don't survive our youth, we won't make it to old age at all. So Daniel says if we're being kind of sensible, if we're being smart planners, if we're thinking about our lives as a whole, then we would kind of weight things towards our childhood and our adolescence. And because he thinks that we can, in a sense, see this intrapersonal decision as a model for interpersonal justice, he says that therefore it's not unfair to give more resources to kind of weight goods towards the young. And he's particularly interested in this idea in healthcare, but we can maybe expand it to other areas. Okay, so that's a kind of quite prominent view of age group justice. We might think, though, that there are a couple of worries here. One is, surely there are limits to how far this intrapersonal model is going to apply to interpersonal justice. So you might think that if you are kind of trying to be this sensible, prudent allocator, thinking about your whole life, starting from the beginning, when it comes to thinking about very late ages, so your late 90s into your hundreds, if you're kind of being a prudent planner, you might think, well, I'm very unlikely to make it that far, right? Even in a wealthy country like the UK, I'm probably not going to make it to 100. So prudentially, I ought to assign very little or even nothing to my 100th year, right? Because if I don't make it, then those resources are just wasted. But we might think that even if that's true, even if that's the right decision from a prudential perspective, from a kind of pragmatic view, that doesn't really tell us anything about how we ought to treat actual 100-year-olds, right? That doesn't show that we ought to assign very little resources to improving the lives of people when they're 100 and allowing them to live very meager lives. So there's a worry there about how far Daniels' model actually applies to justice. It's also worth noting that, as Christine Overall points out, the elderly, which Daniels kind of seems to talk about, aren't a monolith, right? Not all elderly people are the same. So some elderly people, when they reach their 80th, 90th year, have lived extremely good lives, full of opportunity, full of good experiences. But other people have lived actually quite poor lives. So even when they reach their 80th or 90th year, they've not really enjoyed much opportunity or much well-being or much happiness. And so we might worry about the idea that we should treat all elderly people in the same way, given that variation in quality of life. Remember then that Daniels has this problem with age group inequality, but not with intergenerational inequality, but not with age group inequality. We might also think that there's a worry about being too concerned with this idea of intergenerational unfairness. So at least on one view of intergenerational unfairness, it would imply that today's youth should have the same opportunities as today's elderly had when they were young. But of course, we might think that actually the sign of a just society is that it gives better opportunities to today's youth, right? It takes advantage of progress in technology or in being wealthier than we were 50, 60 years ago. And so there's a worry that if we insist on each age group, each generation having the same opportunities, the same kind of level of welfare, quality of life as their predecessors did when they were occupying that age group, that actually we're shrugging off this opportunity to progress, to make things better. Okay, so I've talked a bit there about this topic that's sometimes called distributive justice, right? So that's kind of, in a sense, how do we allocate burdens and benefits? But that's not the only kind of justice that we might be interested in. We might also be interested in what's sometimes called relational justice. So this is concerned with not who gets what, as we might term distributive justice, but how we interact with each other, how we relate as fellow persons, as fellow citizens. And probably the dominant view of relational justice in philosophy today is, perhaps understandably, an egalitarian view, right? A view which says that we ought to be able to relate to each other as equals, right? So we ought to be able to, in a sense, look each other in the eye and have respect for each other as equals. There's a question about whether this kind of model, this egalitarian model, should be applied intergenerationally. So if you're a thoroughgoing egalitarian when it comes to relational justice, you're going to say, yeah, absolutely. Doesn't matter what age you are or what generation you're part of. You should be able to interact with others as equals. There should be no kind of difference in your status or how others treat you just because of your age. That contrasts with maybe a more traditional view, which has been advocated by philosophers, including the bioethicist Dan Callahan, which is that actually in our relational justice, there are distinctive age-specific roles that people take on in society that are informed by their age. So Callahan thinks, for instance, that when you reach old age, which he defines as 70, your social role, part of your obligations to others, is to kind of step aside, right? It's to make room for the next generation coming up. So he thinks, for instance, that older people shouldn't hang on to their jobs. They should sort of gracefully retire. And he's also interested in healthcare resource allocation. Callahan suggests, when it comes to deciding whether to give people treatment that will extend their lives, older people should maybe refuse that treatment and allow those resources to be spent on ensuring that younger people can survive to old age. And in turn, younger people and middle-aged people have age-specific obligations to older people. They should give them a kind of distinctive source of respect, Callahan says, see them as sources of wisdom. And there's also an injustice, he thinks, if older people hang on to their jobs, not because just they want to, but because they're financially unable to retire. So Callahan thinks there's something gone wrong in a society that forces older people to carry on working past when they should have stepped aside. So final kind of topic in this issue of contemporaneous generations that I want to just talk about is political representation. So if we think about this idea of distinctive social roles that different generations or different age groups might have, one kind of role that we might think generations have when they occupy middle age and old age is to act as custodians for the future, to look after the environment, the planet, society, the economy, various cultural institutions for future generations. And of course, one place where we see quite a lot of discussion about generational justice or injustice is in this very area. So obviously lots of discussion around perceived failures to properly look after the environment by today's adults. And one way that we might try to tackle this problem that has been suggested by some philosophers is thinking about representative justice, so justice in political representation. So we can observe, for instance, that the average voter and the average representative are considerably older than the average citizen, right? So the average voter by law in the UK is, has to be at least 18 in England, I think 16 in Scotland. And the average political representative is, of course, older than that. But the average citizen is much younger than that because children are citizens. And so there's this worry that some people kind of raise, which is that because our political system is set up in this age-skewed way, so that our voters and our political representatives, so that our political decision makers are older than the average citizen, what you get is a kind of neglect of the interests of younger people and the views of younger people. And so people have advocated a couple of ways to try to correct this, a couple of ways to try to ensure a greater level of age group justice when it comes to political representation. One of these is lowering the voting age. Right? So at the moment, as I say, in England and Wales, at least, we have a voting age of 18. It could be much lower, right? It could be lowered to 16 or even lower than that, 14. We might also think that there should be some mechanisms for ensuring that the interests of younger people are represented in voting, even if that's not through direct voting by younger people. So younger people could have proxies to vote for them, people who understand how the political process works. You might also think that when it comes to kind of formal representation, there should be more formal mechanisms for ensuring that younger people are represented. So the political philosopher Juliana Bedard-Nier has suggested that we should have youth quotas in political representation. So in the UK Parliament, for instance, that we should ensure that a representative proportion of MPs are from, say, under 35s or under 30s, to make sure that the views of younger people are being represented in Parliament, that it's not all middle-aged and older people. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of some of the main issues that come up when we think about justice between contemporaneous generations. There are others that we might think about, but those are maybe some of the kind of main issues that might be interesting to discuss. So in the last kind of 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to just talk briefly about this second question of whether there's anything distinctive about our obligations to distant future generations. So a reminder, by distant future, I just mean people with whom we won't directly interact, right? So there are people who don't exist currently who don't count as distant future generations on this view. So for instance, someone who's born next week doesn't currently exist, isn't currently contemporaneous with me, but they're going to be contemporaneous with me very soon. So I'm not including them in this. Let's simplify things. Let's think about people with whom I will never interact, people who live in 100 years' time or 200 years' time, the distant future. What do we owe those people? Well, there are various views we might take and various views that philosophers have taken. Here's an extreme view. We don't owe them anything. So on some kind of contractualist models of political justice, we only have obligations of justice to people whom we can contract with, to people whom we can enter into deliberation with to decide how we want to live together. And of course, a person who lives in 200 years' time is not someone I can enter into deliberation with. It's not someone I can have a two-way symmetrical relationship with. And so according to this contractualist view, I don't have any obligations of justice towards them. Now, remember this distinction we drew between justice and, say, beneficence. Saying that I have no obligations of justice doesn't mean I have no moral reason to benefit them at all. It just means that they have no complaint against me if I don't act in certain ways that benefit. Okay, so that's one quite extreme view of what we owe the future. Here are a few more. We might owe them equality, right? So remember I talked about this idea of relational distributive equality earlier. Some egalitarians think that actually the time gap between me and other people doesn't affect the fact that we ought to be in egalitarian relationships with them, right? That we ought to ensure that they have just as good lives as we do. A further view that we might adopt, less demanding than that, is what might be called a sufficiency view. So this is the view that we don't owe the distant future equality, but we do owe them a kind of minimum decent standard of living, right? If we think that our behavior is going to cause people to drop below some standard of living, that remains to be defined, then we've failed our obligations of justice, but we don't owe them any more than that. And finally, I think probably quite a popular view, if you asked people who haven't worked on this area of philosophy, is to say that actually we owe them better lives than we have. Right? So that actually our role as people who have control over how the world goes in the future is to make sure that things improve for future generations, that things get better. That's probably the most demanding view that we could take. that actually we ought to act now to ensure that people in the future have better lives than we do. All right, so I want to finish, we've got just a few minutes left of my speaking time, with a kind of interesting puzzle that's sometimes raised in this context. And this comes from the well-known philosopher Derek Parfit. It's called the non-identity problem. So I've spoken a bit about how we can affect how the lives of people go in the future go, right? So we can affect the environment, we can affect whether certain kind of social and cultural institutions still exist, we can affect what society is like, what the economy is like, but we can also affect, Parfit thinks, the identities of people who exist in the future, right? So it's not just that we're affecting how well their lives go, we're also affecting who exists. It's not that we get to kind of pick in any purposeful way who exists, right? We don't say, well, I want Bob to exist rather than Jim. It's that the way we act, Parfit suggests, is going to have considerable influence over the people who exist. That might sound a bit odd, so let's kind of delve into the argument in a bit more detail. So each of us exists, obviously, as the result of an act of procreation, right? As a result of two people having sex. There are, of course, a few exceptions to this, IVF, for instance, but the vast majority of us exist because of an event like this. Now, Parfit suggests if your parents had procreated at a different time, then a different sperm cell and a different egg cell would have been involved in the act of procreation. And he thinks that that would have meant that a different person came into existence. So your identity, Parfit suggests, is dependent on a bunch of things, but it's dependent at least on the physical identity of the particular cells that came together to create you. Different procreative acts at a different time would have resulted in a different person. You wouldn't exist. And we can generalize this. If most decisions that we can take at a kind of social level, most big decisions that will affect the world that future generations inherit, will also affect the way that people behave today. Right, will affect who they meet, who they choose to procreate with, when they choose to procreate. And so that will result in a number of different people coming into existence. And the further we go into the future, Parfit suggests, the more likely it becomes that the people who exist as the result of a particular set of decisions are completely different. There's nobody who exists in that timeline that would have existed if we'd chosen differently. So for instance, if we decide today not to bother with climate change, not to care about it, not to worry about global warming or global climate change, then that decision will cause a particular set of people to exist in the future who would not have existed if we'd chosen to take climate change seriously and tackle it. And what does that mean? Well, Parfit says that creates a problem for a particular view of our obligations to future people. So if on this view, we've got this kind of choice, right? We've got this choice between take climate change seriously and don't take it seriously. Of course, there are various options in the middle, but take those two extremes. If we don't take climate change seriously, the result is a certain set of people in the future. And those people might face various challenges, right? The world will be much harder to live in. Their lives will be difficult in various ways that ours aren't. But according to Parfit's view, those people have no complaint, at least on a certain way of understanding obligation. Because if we'd chosen differently, if we'd chosen instead to take climate change seriously, to tackle it, to make sure that it didn't become a serious problem, those people wouldn't have existed. And why does that mean they don't have a complaint? Well, it means that if we take a view of obligation, which goes like this, which says that we can only wrong people if we harm them. And harming means making someone worse off than they would have been if we'd acted differently. So on this view of obligation, Parfit says, we have a bit of a problem. We have quite an extreme view, which is we don't appear to have many obligations to future generations at all. Because even if we act in various ways that make their lives difficult, if we'd acted differently, they wouldn't exist. And so as long as their lives are worth living, they have no complaint against us on this person-affecting view. Now, there's a kind of caveat here, which is that it might be that climate change makes things so bad that people's lives in the future aren't worth living. right? That actually living is worse than never having been born. And if that's true, then even on a person affecting view, people in the future have a complaint, right? Because we've made them worse off than they would have been if we'd acted differently. But that suggests quite a low bar for our obligations to the future. It suggests that actually all we owe them is to make sure that we don't act in ways that make their lives not worth living. Okay, so I've had my time, I think. So I'll stop sharing for now so I can see you all. And open things up to see if there's any questions or points people would like to make. Yeah, I've got one question there, I think, from Janet.
Yes, thank you for your excellent speaking. I have two questions. The first question is about, could you explain more about the meaning of intergenerational justice? Because when you talk about Norman Daniels' point of view and the Red Party, it seems they just discuss different groups of people. Like Norman Daniel, he talks about people have exist in the world, but the Red Party, he talks about some people they haven't come into the world. So could you explain more the meaning of intergenerational justice?
Yeah.
Is the first question. My second question is I'm a little bit skeptical if it's possible have a comprehensive point of view about intergenerational justice because it depends on what issue we discuss, like environmental issues or workplace or voting political representative or biases. This is totally different. So I just am skeptical if there is a comprehensive principle or theory to discuss this kind of problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. So yeah, two questions there. The first one, you're absolutely right, and sorry if I made things confusing there. I guess what I was trying to get across is that there are different things we might mean by intergenerational. So you're quite right that the two kind of broad issues I touched on involve very different sets of people. And both of those kind of questions could be what we mean when we talk about intergenerational justice. So the question is whether it makes a difference, right? Does it make a difference that a particular person who's from a different generation to me is someone who I coexist with, who currently exists, or whether there's someone who will exist in the far future? Some people say no. Some people say we should have exactly the same principles applying to both kinds of questions. But as we saw, other people say yes. Other people say it matters that in one case, I kind of can interact with people. I can talk to them like you right now. And in another case, I can't, right? In another case, there's this kind of asymmetry between how I can affect them, but they maybe can't affect me in the same way. And then your second question, yeah, I don't know. I didn't want to imply that there is a kind of master principle. Again, some people think there is. Some people think that there's kind of just one principle. So if you're a utilitarian, for instance, you might say, well, there's only one principle. It's just make sure there's as much happiness in the world as possible. And that applies in all kinds of scenarios. Doesn't matter whether it's employment or the environment or whatever. But you're quite right. We might think that actually the context that we're thinking about really makes a big difference to what we owe to people, right? That actually, whether we're talking about the environment, which is, you know, as we've seen, so kind of fundamental to having any quality of life at all, or whether we're talking about, you know, fairness in the workplace, those might be very different questions, and it might be that we think there are different principles that apply in each case. So I agree with you, essentially. You're quite right. I think we've got Sam next.
I've got dozens of questions, so I'm just going to try and pick my strongest one. I've got one observation and one question at this stage.
Yeah.
My observation is on Parfit and the argument that if we had chosen differently, then the people who exist in the future would have been different people. Well, the the evidence you gave for that, which is the act of procreation.
Yeah.
I completely get that. And the non-identity, had I been procreated a month later, I'd be someone different. But I'm not sure that is, I can't remember the right technical or philosophical phrase for two parallel arguments that actually don't fit together. He's using the non-identity argument to say that we don't owe future generations a good environment, so things that we don't take. But
just to be clear, Parfit's view is that if we adopt a person affecting view, that implies that we don't owe them anything. So Parfit thinks that's a reason to reject the person affecting view.
But there will be people, even if they're not the same people.
Yeah.
And so therefore, that seems to me a weakness in his argument, because no matter who the people are, whether we owe them an obligation doesn't change by virtue of the exact person. Can I pose my other question, and you might want to choose one, because I don't want to hog the whole one. And the other one is kind of going in the opposite direction and thinking about things like slavery and whether today's generations owe an obligation. You said about whether we have obligations to the dead and previous generations. But going in the opposite direction, does the current generation have an obligation to make reparations for misdemeanors and crimes of previous generations? Does that come under this intergenerational?
Yeah, absolutely.
Topic?
Let me just touch on the Parfit thing very quickly. Parfit's argument is a kind of challenge to a particular view of obligation, right? So, the view of obligation he's interested in, which he thinks is a very popular one, at least in philosophy, is the view that we only wrong people by making them worse off, right? Now you can reject that view. You can say, actually, there are lots of different ways of wronging people, and Parfit does reject that view. He says, actually, you can do something wrong when it makes things, as he puts it, impersonally worse. So there's less happiness in the world, but no particular individual is worse off because they wouldn't have existed in this other kind of timeline. So it's not that Parfit thinks we can't do wrong things as regards future generations. It's just that he thinks there's a problem for what might seem like a kind of natural way of thinking about that, which is the way we wrong people is by making them worse off than they would have been if we'd acted differently. So, as you say, we then need to think about, well, okay, if that's not the view that we should adopt, what is the right view of obligation? If it's not that we have this, our obligations are limited to don't make people worse off than they would have been, what are our obligations? And as you say, we can think about that in various ways and say, well, these are still people, there's still ways we can affect them. So we might have a kind of non-comparative view that says you can wrong people by making it so that they face certain kinds of challenges. You can wrong people by making it so that it's very difficult for them to find fresh water. That's a form of wronging, even though it doesn't make them worse off, because they wouldn't have existed otherwise. Does that make sense? Is that kind of, yeah? So on the reparations question, it's a great question. You know, look, we only had kind of half an hour to talk, and there are a number of things we could have touched on that are kind of interesting in this topic. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that is at least to some extent an intergenerational question, right? It's a question that maybe takes on a slightly more complicated structure than some of the questions I was looking at, because it's a question maybe about what we owe to the future, perhaps as a result of what we owe to the past. So there's a kind of particular view of what we owe to the future, which might draw on the idea that we have obligations to the past, which says that we kind of have an obligation to pay it forward. So people in the past did things that make my life good in various ways, right? They've kind of created a society that I can live in. They've created certain kinds of institutions that benefit me. And there's not a lot I can do to directly repay that. Maybe there are some things, right? Maybe I can kind of write praiseworthy poems about them or go and visit their graves or whatever it might be. There's not kind of really a direct way I can do that. But we might think that I can sort of